Imagine walking through the streets of ancient Rome. Marble temples gleam in the sunlight. Senators in white togas hurry toward the forum, and soldiers march proudly, carrying the standards of an empire that stretches across continents. But behind this glittering facade lies the backbone of Rome's power: millions of slaves. Slavery in Rome wasn't just a side note. It was the engine that powered the entire empire. From farming to building, from domestic service to entertainment in the gladiatorial arena, slaves were everywhere. To the Romans, slavery was not only normal but absolutely essential. And yet, despite the near-absolute authority of masters, there were boundaries. Things slave owners could not do. That's right. Even in a society where one human could legally own another, there were rules, customs, and moral expectations that limited what masters could do. Today, we're going to explore those limits and along the way, uncover the hidden world of slavery in ancient Rome. This is the story of power, control, survival, and law, and of the surprising ways Roman society tried to balance cruelty with order. Welcome to What Couldn't Owners Do to Slaves in Ancient Rome, and more, and more. Section 1. The Scale of Roman Slavery. Slavery in Rome was massive. Estimates suggest that during the height of the Roman Empire, slaves may have made up 20 to 30% of the entire population. In some Italian cities, nearly 1 in every 3 people you passed on the street was a slave. But how did so many people become enslaved? War captives. Every Roman conquest brought back thousands of prisoners who were sold in slave markets. Piracy and trade. Merchants trafficked humans across the Mediterranean. Birth. Children born to enslaved mothers automatically became slaves. Debt or punishment. Sometimes, people sold themselves or their children into slavery. Slaves filled every corner of Roman life. They worked in agriculture, mined silver and gold, built aqueducts and amphitheaters, served in wealthy households, and even taught Roman children if they were educated Greeks. But here's where things get complicated. Roman slavery was not exactly the same as slavery in more modern times, like in the Americas. In Rome, slaves could sometimes earn or buy their freedom. Some became rich after manumission, even rising to positions of influence. Yet while they were slaves, they remained legally property. Their masters had immense control over them. So what, if anything, couldn't these masters do? To answer that, we need to understand first what they could do. Section 2. What owners could do by Roman law. A slave was not considered a full person. Legally, they were property, much like land, tools, or animals. This status gave owners terrifyingly broad rights. Work without pay. Slaves had no wages. Their labor belonged entirely to the master. Control of movement. Slaves couldn't freely leave, travel, or marry without permission. Punishment. Masters could discipline slaves with whips, chains, or branding. Sale or transfer. Slaves could be bought, sold, or given away at will. Exploitation. Owners controlled not just the labor but even the bodies of their slaves. From this list, it seems like masters could do absolutely anything, and in many cases they did. Ancient writers tell of cruel owners who tortured slaves for amusement or forced them into humiliating roles. But here's the surprising part: Roman society, law, and even religion created limits. These limits weren't based on the idea of human rights like today, but rather on maintaining social order, preventing rebellion, and protecting the economic value of slaves. And that brings us to the real focus of this story: what owners couldn't do. What owners couldn't do to slaves in ancient Rome. Now, at this point you might be thinking, wait a second, if slaves were property, if masters had so much power, then what could they possibly not do? Was there really any limit at all? And the answer is yes. Even in a world as brutal as Rome, there were invisible lines that owners couldn't cross. Not because Rome was merciful, but because the Romans were practical. They wanted order, stability, and productivity. And believe it or not, that meant even slaves had some protections. Let's break it down. Law number 1. Owners couldn't kill slaves without cause. Here's the big one. By the early empire, masters couldn't just kill their slaves for fun. Crazy, right? Because if you think about slavery in the movies, you imagine masters doing whatever they want. But Rome introduced restrictions. Emperor Hadrian, in the 12th century CE, officially banned the casual execution of slaves. If a master wanted a slave killed, there had to be a legitimate reason, usually tied to crime, rebellion, or attempted escape. Why? Because the government realized that killing slaves on a whim wasted valuable labor. Slaves were expensive investments. Imagine spending a fortune on trained workers, only to murder them out of anger. That wasn't just cruel, it was bad business. So while slaves lived under constant fear, they at least knew that their master couldn't legally slaughter them just because of a bad mood. Law number 2, no mass punishment without review. Here's another limit. Let's say one slave in a household committed a crime. Could the master punish all the slaves together? Well, sometimes yes, but not always. Roman law actually reviewed these cases. If a master wanted to execute a large group of slaves after an incident, the Senate often had to step in. Why? Because killing too many slaves at once could spark fear, unrest, and rebellion. And Rome definitely didn't want angry, desperate slaves rising up. Remember Spartacus? That gladiator who led a massive slave revolt? Yeah, Rome learned from him. They knew if you treated slaves too harshly, you risked another rebellion. So they tried to balance terror with control. Law number 3. Owners couldn't mutilate slaves without limits. This one's shocking. In some households, branding, tattooing, or mutilating slaves was common. It was a way to mark ownership. But over time, Rome began to discourage excessive mutilation. Why? Because once again, damaged slaves were less valuable. Think about it, a strong worker in the fields was worth more than someone permanently injured. So while punishment was allowed, completely ruining a slave's body was frowned upon, unless it was for criminal reasons. Law number 4. Owners couldn't deny religious rights. Now, here's a strange one. Rome was obsessed with religion. They believed every person. Even slaves had a spiritual connection to the gods. Denying slaves certain rituals or preventing them from worshiping was seen as dangerous, even unlucky. So while a master could force a slave to work, he usually couldn't completely stop them from participating in household religious practices. Why? Because if the gods were offended, the entire household might suffer, and no Roman wanted angry gods. Law number 5. Owners couldn't block manumission. This is where things get interesting. In Rome, slaves could actually be freed through a process called manumission. And once freed, they became Roman citizens with legal rights. Masters, of course, controlled when this happened. But Roman law gave slaves pathways to freedom if they had served loyally or bought their way out. In fact, there were rules stopping owners from unreasonably blocking freedom when it had already been promised. Think about how wild that is. A society built on slavery had system that allowed slaves to become free people. It wasn't common everywhere in history, but Rome made it part of their culture. Law number 6. Owners couldn't use slaves in certain roles, believe it or not. There were jobs Roman law didn't want slaves doing. For example, slaves couldn't legally serve as soldiers in the legions. Why? Because the Romans didn't want armed slaves trained in combat. Again, fear of rebellion. They also restricted slaves from holding official government positions. Sure, slaves could work in administration, but they couldn't act as public officials or senators. That power was reserved for free citizens. Law number 7. Owners couldn't deny basic survival needs. Here's a practical one. Masters had to provide slaves with food, clothing, and shelter. If they didn't, and a slave starved to death, the owner could face legal trouble. Not because Rome was kind, but because the government saw it as neglect of property. Daily life of slaves in ancient Rome, all right, so we've talked about the laws. But what did life actually feel like for a slave in ancient Rome? What did their mornings look like? What jobs did they do? What kind of world did they wake up to every single day? Let's step inside their shoes. Life in a wealthy household. Imagine you're a slave in a rich Roman villa. The marble floors are cold under your bare feet as you rise before sunrise. Your job? To make sure your master's day starts smoothly. Some slaves worked as cooks, preparing elaborate meals that could take hours to put together. Others were house servants, polishing silver, cleaning courtyards, or helping their mistress dress. Wealthy Romans often had slaves called cubicularii, whose job was literally to stand guard by the master's bedroom at night. And if you were unlucky, you might be the slave responsible for handling the chamber pot. Not glamorous, but here's the twist: in rich households, some slaves were treated surprisingly well. Educated Greek slaves, for example, often worked as teachers for Roman children. These slaves could live comfortably, eat decent food, and even have influence within the family. Some were trusted advisors managing money and estates. So daily life for household slaves ranged from humiliating chores to positions of respect. Life on the farm. Now let's zoom out to the countryside. This is where the majority of Roman slaves lived, on massive agricultural estates called latifundia. Here, life was tough. Slaves woke up at dawn, worked the fields all day, and collapsed at night in crowded, rough huts. Their jobs included plowing, harvesting, tending animals, and maintaining vineyards. And unlike household slaves, farm slaves faced brutal discipline. Overseers carried whips, and anyone who slowed down could be chained or beaten. Imagine working in the scorching Italian sun with little water, knowing that exhaustion wasn't an excuse. That was reality for thousands. Farm slaves weren't just workers. They were part of an industrial system. Rome's economy depended heavily on them. Life in the mines. But if you really want to picture the worst kind of slave life, go underground. Literally. Slaves in Roman mines had the harshest fate. They worked in dark tunnels, hacking at rock, inhaling dust, sometimes chained together. Accidents were common. Death from exhaustion, cave-ins, or poisoned air wasn't unusual. And here's the kicker. Unlike household slaves or even farm workers, mine slaves had almost no chance of freedom. They were considered expendable. If you ended up in the mines, you were basically working until death. Think about that the next time you see Roman gold jewelry or silver coins. Behind that glitter was human suffering. Life in gladiator schools, of course. Not all slaves worked in silence. Some were forced into the most famous. Role of all, gladiators. Picture this. You're a strong young man captured in war and sold to a gladiator school. You train every day with wooden swords, preparing to fight for the entertainment of thousands. It sounds glamorous. The roar of the Colosseum. The chance to win glory. But reality? It was terrifying. Most gladiators were slaves, and they lived under strict discipline. Their bodies were owned, their survival depended on skill, and death was always waiting in the arena. And yet, here's the strange part. Some gladiators became celebrities. If you survived long enough and fought bravely, the crowd might love you. Masters could even grant freedom to starfighters. So for a few lucky ones, the arena wasn't just death, it was a path to fame. But make no mistake, for every one gladiator who became a hero, dozens died anonymous deaths, their blood staining the sand. Daily struggles and survival, no matter where they worked, villa, farm, mine, or arena, slaves shared the same struggles. Control of movement. Slaves couldn't leave without permission. Family, marriages weren't legal for slaves. They could have partners, but masters could separate families at any time. Imagine being sold away from your children, never seeing them again. It happened constantly. Names. Many slaves were stripped of their original names and given Roman nicknames, often humiliating ones like Felix, Lucky, or Tyro, Newbie. Freedom dangled. Masters sometimes promised freedom, but delayed it for years. Slaves lived in constant hope and fear, and yet, slaves found ways to survive. They built friendships, they shared songs and stories. Some even managed to save small amounts of money, hoping one day to buy freedom. Daily life was hard, but it wasn't completely hopeless. The psychology of being owned. Now here's something we often forget. Slavery wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Imagine living, every moment knowing you weren't considered a full person. Every decision in your life depended on someone else, your woe. Think about it. If you were working in a Roman household, you might believe, deep down, that loyalty and patience could one day earn you freedom. That dream made the system more stable, because slaves with hope were less likely to rebel. In a twisted way, manumission wasn't just generosity, it was strategy. Rome controlled millions of slaves, and this little spark of hope helped keep them in line. Transition to next section. So now we've seen both sides, the crushing weight of slavery, and the slim but real chance of escape. But here's the thing. Rome wasn't the only society with slavery. To really understand how unique or not Roman slavery was, we need to compare it. What made Roman slavery different from Greek slavery, or from the horrific transatlantic slavery centuries later? That's where we're going next. Comparisons across history paths to freedom, okay? So here's a question. If you were a slave in ancient Rome, was there any light at the end of the tunnel? Any chance of breaking free from the chains? And the answer is, surprisingly, yes. Unlike some other slave systems in history, Rome actually had an official pathway to freedom. It wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't guaranteed, but thousands of slaves managed to climb out of bondage and into citizenship. And some didn't just survive, they thrived. Let's talk about how. Manumission. The Roman word for freedom, the process of freeing a slave in Rome, was called manumission. Literally, sending out from the hand. Literally, sending out from the hand. Think about that image, the master opening his hand, letting the slave go. There were three main ways this happened. 1. By ceremony. Sometimes a master would take a loyal slave to a magistrate. The magistrate would touch the slave with a special rod, and just like that, the slave was declared free. 2. By will. A master could write in his will that certain slaves would be freed after his death. This was common in wealthy families, almost like a final reward for years of service. 3. By informal agreement. Some masters freed slaves without ceremony, simply by granting them independence in front of witnesses. But here's the cool part. Once freed, a slave became a Roman citizen. They weren't second-class residents, they were citizens, with legal rights, the ability to own property, and even the chance to start businesses. But there were strings attached, of course. Rome being Rome, freedom wasn't always 100% free. A freed slave, called a libertus, male, or liberta, female, usually had obligations to their former master. These were called patron-client relationships. Basically, you're free, but you still owe me loyalty. The freedman might have to support his former master in politics. He might owe services or gifts. He was expected to show respect, almost like a child to a parent. So freedom was real, but it wasn't always total independence. Success stories now. Here's where it gets fascinating. Some freed slaves rose higher than anyone expected. Take Tiro, the personal secretary of the famous Roman orator Cicero. Tiro was originally a slave, but he was brilliant. He invented a system of shorthand writing that helped record Cicero's speeches. Eventually, Cicero freed him, and Tiro went on to live a long life as a respected scholar. His shorthand system influenced writing for centuries. Or consider Epictetus, who started life as a slave in the household of Emperor Nero's secretary. Despite his lowly status, he studied philosophy. After gaining freedom, he became one of the most famous Stoic philosophers in history, teaching that true freedom comes from controlling your mind, not your circumstances. And then there were freed slaves who got rich. Some became successful merchants, builders, or bankers. Because they were once slaves, they couldn't run for the highest political offices, but they're there. Children could. Imagine that. A man born in chains, whose son might grow up to be a senator. That's Rome for you. Brutal, but full of strange opportunities. Freedom wasn't always easy, but let's be clear, not every freed slave lived a dream life. Some were freed only when they were too old or sick to work, meaning they had freedom, but no means to survive. Others found that prejudice never fully went away. Romans often looked down on freedmen as tainted by slavery. And of course, the risk of being re-enslaved was always there. If a freed slave couldn't support themselves or broke certain laws, they might fall back into bondage. So yes, freedom existed, but it came with risks, challenges, and social stigma. The big picture still, manumission made Roman slavery very different from many others. It gave slaves something powerful, hope. The cultural impact of slavery in Rome. Okay, so far we've talked about laws, daily life, freedom, and comparisons. But here's something most people forget. Slavery wasn't just an economic system in Rome. It shaped the entire culture. The food Romans ate, the art they admired, the stories they told, even the way they prayed to the gods. Slavery was everywhere. It was so deeply woven into daily life that Romans couldn't imagine their world without it. Let's break down exactly how slavery changed Roman culture. First, the obvious one, money. Rome's economy was built on slave labor. Those massive farms, the latifundia, they produced grain, olives, and wine on a scale so huge that they fed not just Italy but the empire. None of it worked without slaves. In the cities, slaves ran workshops, worked in markets, and even staffed government offices. Think about that. Roman officials relied on slaves to handle paperwork, accounts, and records. In a way, the Roman government itself was powered by slaves. And then there was construction. The Colosseum, aqueducts, roads stretching thousands of miles, all of it built on the backs of slaves. Without them, the empire's famous infrastructure would never have existed. Slavery wasn't just part of the economy, it was the economy. Now, here's a surprising one. Religion. Slaves were fully involved in Roman religious life. Every household had its own shrine, the lararium, where daily prayers were made to the gods. Slaves took part in these rituals, sometimes even leading them. And for Romans, this wasn't optional. They believed if slaves were denied the chance to honor the gods, the entire household risked divine punishment. So even though slaves had no legal status, spiritually they were seen as part of the household family. There were even cults and mystery religions, like the cult of Isis from Egypt, where slaves could join alongside free citizens. Religion blurred the lines of status in ways the law never did. Now let's talk about art. When you picture Roman statues, mosaics, and frescoes, remember this. Slaves were often the ones who made them. Skilled Greek slaves were brought to Rome to sculpt marble, paint murals, and craft jewelry. In fact, many of the masterpieces we admire today were created by people who technically had no freedom at all. Their names are lost, but their work survives in museums. Even in literature, slavery left its mark. Some Roman comedies, like those of Plautus and Terence, featured clever slave characters who often outsmarted their masters. These plays were wildly popular, and they showed Romans wrestling with the paradox of slavery, powerless in reality, but powerful in imagination. Ever heard the phrase, "do the dirty work"? In Rome, that literally came from slaves. Menial, unpleasant tasks became associated with slavery, while free work meant higher status. Even the Latin word service, slave, shaped European languages. Words like servant, service, and even serf in medieval times all trace back to Roman slavery. That's how deeply it left its fingerprints on culture. Here's something else. Slavery shaped how Romans saw themselves. To be free in Rome wasn't just about not being a slave. It was the core of Roman identity. Roman citizens prided themselves on being free men. The very idea of Roman liberty stood in direct contrast to slavery. And yet, Rome couldn't exist without slaves. It's this strange contradiction. Freedom for some was only possible because others weren't free. And finally, let's not forget philosophy. Some of Rome's greatest thinkers, like Seneca and Epictetus, wrote about slavery. Seneca, a Stoic philosopher, argued that masters should treat slaves more humanely, reminding his readers that the man you call your slave is born of the same stock, enjoys the same stock, enjoys the same sky, breathes, lives, and dies just as you do. And Epictetus, he was a slave. He taught that true freedom comes not from your external status, but from your inner control. His words still inspire people today. So in a strange twist, the experience of slavery itself produced ideas about freedom that outlasted Rome. Dramatic pause. So when you look at Roman culture, the wealth, the art, the religion, even the philosophy, remember, it was all shaped by slavery. Rome wasn't just an empire of soldiers and senators. It was an empire of slaves. Their work, their suffering, and their resilience built the culture we still study today. But nothing lasts forever. As powerful as Rome was, its system of slavery eventually began to crack. The economy shifted, society changed, and new forces rose that made slavery less central. So next, let's explore how and why slavery in Rome began to decline. The decline of Roman slavery. Rome was built on slavery. But here's the twist. The very system that made Rome powerful eventually started to fall apart. It didn't happen overnight. There wasn't a single law that said, slavery is over. Instead, it was a slow, messy decline, shaped by economics, culture, war, and even religion. So let's break down exactly why Roman slavery weakened, and how this ancient world of masters and slaves finally unraveled. Economic shifts first. Money. For centuries, Rome's slave supply depended on conquest. Every war brought back thousands of captives who were sold into slavery. That's how Rome filled its farms, mines, and households. But once Rome stopped expanding, especially after the 12th century CA, the supply of slaves dried up. No more endless wars, no more fresh captives, and buying slaves wasn't cheap. Owners had to feed them, house them, and risk losing them if they rebelled or ran away. Slowly, landowners realized it was often cheaper to hire free workers who could take care of themselves. This shift from slave labor to tenant farming, colony, was a game changer. The economy itself began to move away from slavery. The cost of revolt. Now let's talk about fear. Rome had seen massive slave uprisings, like the famous revolt led by Spartacus in 73 BCE. These revolts terrified Roman elites. Imagine thousands of angry men and women rising up, burning fields and challenging the army. Every rebellion reminded Rome that slaves weren't just property, they were people, and desperate people fight hard. Keeping such a huge enslaved population under control was dangerous and expensive. Over time, this fear encouraged Romans to rely less on slaves and more on other systems of labor. The role of Christianity. Now here's a big one: religion. When Christianity spread across the empire, it didn't immediately abolish slavery. Early Christians accepted it as part of society, but the religion carried ideas that slowly undermined the system. Christian teachings said that all souls were equal before God. Slave or free, rich or poor, everyone was part of the same spiritual family. Church leaders began encouraging masters to treat slaves more humanely. Some even freed their slaves as an act of faith. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Christian emperors were passing laws that gave slaves new rights, like the ability to seek refuge in churches if they were abused. It wasn't full freedom, but it was a step toward dismantling the old system. And then came chaos. From the 3rd to 5th centuries CE, Rome faced wave after wave of invasions. Goths, Vandals, Huns. Farms were destroyed, cities sacked, trade disrupted. The old economic order collapsed. In this new world, slavery became harder to maintain. Landowners couldn't rely on slave markets anymore. Instead, they turned to new labor systems, like binding peasants to the land. This shift gave birth to something new: medieval serfdom. It wasn't slavery, but it wasn't freedom either. Peasants couldn't be bought and sold like property, but they were tied to their lord's land, forced to work it for protection. The Roman state itself also began to chip away at slavery. By late antiquity, laws were passed that made it harder to kill slaves without consequences. Masters couldn't simply do whatever they wanted anymore. Slaves gained the right to complain about cruel treatment and sometimes even won cases against their owners. Manumission, freeing slaves, also became more common. By the 4th century CE, freedmen were a huge part of Roman society, blending into the free population. So what does this all mean? Rome didn't end slavery because of one big revolution. Instead, the system collapsed under its own weight. Wars stopped feeding it. Economics made it less practical. Religion challenged its morality. And social changes gave birth to new systems. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, slavery still existed, but it was no longer the foundation of society. The age of Roman slavery had ended, replaced by the feudal order of the Middle Ages. Think about that. An empire that once thrived on human bondage couldn't hold on to it forever. Change came slowly, painfully, but it came. And that brings us to the final piece of this journey. What lessons does all of this hold for us today? How should we think about the legacy of slavery in Rome, and what it means for our own world? Closing thoughts and modern lessons. So here we are. We've walked through the world of Roman slavery. The laws, the daily life, the struggles for freedom, the cultural impact, and the long decline. And now the question remains, what do we take from all of this? Why does it matter today? Because here's the truth. Slavery in Rome wasn't just a footnote in history. It was a mirror showing us how power works, how power works. How societies justify injustice, and how systems built on inequality eventually crumble. Lesson 1. The paradox of freedom. Rome loved to brag about libertas, liberty. Citizens wore it like a badge of honor. Politicians shouted about it in the forum. Freedom was the pride of Rome. And yet, that freedom only existed because millions of others had none. Roman liberty was built on Roman slavery. That's the paradox. One person's freedom often came at another person's expense, and it forces us to ask, when we talk about freedom today, do we mean it for everyone, or just for some? Lesson 2. The limits of power. Owners in Rome had incredible power over their slaves. But, as we saw, even that power wasn't unlimited. Religion placed boundaries. Law placed boundaries. And sometimes, pure practicality placed boundaries. A master could beat a slave, but not to death without consequences. A master could command loyalty, but not erase the human will to resist. This shows us something timeless. No matter how strong a system of control seems, human dignity finds ways to push back. Lesson 3. The economy of exploitation doesn't last. Rome's entire economy was built on slavery, but in the end, it collapsed. Why? Because it wasn't sustainable. Once conquests slowed down, once rebellions rose up, once the costs outweighed the benefits, the system started breaking apart. History teaches us that exploitation might bring short-term profit, but long-term stability, that requires fairness, cooperation, and respect for human potential. Lesson 4. The power of ideas. For centuries, slavery was seen as normal, natural, even necessary. And then came new ideas, Stoic philosophy, Christian teachings, moral challenges, ideas that questioned the system. And slowly, those ideas changed the world. It's a reminder that ideas are powerful. They might seem small at first. A philosopher writing in a study. A preacher speaking to a small crowd, but they can reshape entire civilizations. Lesson 5. Remembering the forgotten. Finally, there's this. Most Roman slaves never had their names recorded. We don't know their faces, their stories, or their dreams. But they built the empire, they cooked the meals, wrote the documents, built the monuments, fought in the arenas, and raised the children of Rome. The marble we admire, the roads we walk, the ruins we photograph, all of it carries their silent fingerprints. Remembering them gives history its humanity back. So when we ask, what couldn't owners do to slaves in ancient Rome? We uncover more than just laws and customs. We uncover the truth that even in the harshest systems, there are limits. Limits placed by economics, by religion, by rebellion, by morality, and above all, by the unbreakable human spirit. Rome thought slavery would last forever. It didn't. And that's the final lesson, no. System of oppression is eternal. Change always comes. Slowly, painfully, sometimes invisibly, but it comes. So as we close the book on Roman slavery, let's not just see it as distant history. Let's see it as a warning, as a teacher, and as a reminder of what it means to be human, because the sky has no limits. Freedom, once dreamed of, always finds a way to rise.